The wind came down off the jagged spine of the Bitterroot Range like a man looking for a fight. It carried the grit of the high desert and the sulphurous stench of the mining camps, stripping the heat from the air long before the sun had fully set. Below the ridges, the town of Granite Creek sat in a muddy gash of the earth, a collection of timber frames and canvas tents that looked less like a settlement and more like a wound that refused to heal. Elias Thorne watched the town from the crest of the rise. He sat easy in his saddle, though his joints ached with the dull, familiar throb of a long ride. His horse, a roan mare with a white blaze on her nose, shifted her weight, impatient to be out of the biting wind. But Elias did not move. He pulled the collar of his sheepskin coat higher against his neck. He was a man whittled down by hard years, his face a map of deep lines etched by sun and worry. His eyes, the color of wet slate, scanned the single main street below. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. The paper was soft from handling, stained with sweat and tobacco. He did not need to read it again, but he did anyway. It was a warrant. Wanted for questioning in the robbery of the Wells Fargo Overland stage, complicity in the murder of 4 passengers, Clara Vance. The reward was $500. $500 was enough to buy a man a second chance, or at least a headstone for the first one. Elias folded the paper and tucked it away. He remembered the ranch he had lost 2 years ago, the way the drought had turned the soil to gray powder that slipped through his fingers like time. He remembered the silence of the empty house after the fever took his wife and daughter. Mercy was a luxury for men with full bellies and dry roofs. Elias had neither. He had become a hunter of men because the land had rejected him, and he found he had a talent for patience. He nudged the mare with his heels, and they began the slow descent into the muck of Granite Creek. The town was a churn of noise and desperation. The street was a river of sludge, churned by heavy freight wagons and the boots of miners who had spent 12 hours underground. Men shouted in a dozen languages, but the tone was always the same: exhaustion and a frantic need for release. Elias tied his horse at the hitching rail in front of the livery stable, paying the boy a silver dollar to rub her down and give her decent grain. He walked toward the largest structure in town, a 2-story building with a false front painted a peeling yellow. The sign above the batwing doors read, "The Gilded Spur." Elias stepped inside. The heat hit him first, thick with the smell of stale beer, sawdust, and unwashed bodies. A piano player was hammering out a tune in the corner, the notes bright and brittle against the low roar of conversation. Elias moved to the far end of the bar, finding a shadow where the oil lamps did not quite reach. He ordered a whiskey and nursed it, his back to the wall, his hat pulled low. He watched. The hierarchy of the room was clear to anyone who knew how to look. In the center, holding court at a round table, sat Silas Vane. Vane was the owner of the Spur, a man with a waistcoat of green silk that strained against his gut. He laughed loud, showing gold teeth, but his eyes were hard and flat like polished river stones. Flanking him were 2 men who wore their guns low and tied down, hired muscle, there to ensure the house always won. To Vane's right sat the sheriff, a man named Grady with a face like a collapsed dough ball. Grady was drinking from a bottle that Vane had poured, his badge catching the lamplight. He was not a lawman. He was an investment. And then there were the women. They moved through the smoke like bright birds in a cage, their dresses vivid shades of violet, crimson, and emerald. They laughed at jokes that were not funny and smiled with mouths painted red to hide the tightness at the corners. They were the armor of the place, the distraction that kept the miners from burning the town down in their frustration. Elias found her near the stairs. Clara Vance looked younger than he expected, perhaps 24 or 25. She wore a dress of dark blue satin, trimmed with black lace that seemed to mourn the skin it touched. Her hair was piled high, pinned with a comb of imitation pearl, but loose strands fell against her neck. She was laughing at something a dirty-faced prospector was saying, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. It was a practiced touch, light enough to promise, heavy enough to ground him. But Elias saw the moment she turned away. The smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of profound exhaustion. Her shoulders slumped just a fraction of an inch before she caught herself. Her eyes darted toward the back room, then to a young girl, hardly 16, who was carrying a tray of empty glasses. Clara watched the girl with a fierce, protective intensity, her gaze tracking the way a drunk miner reached for the girl's arm. Clara intercepted the man smoothly, distracting him with a fresh bottle and a whisper, steering him away from the child. She was not just working, she was guarding. Elias finished his whiskey. The burn was familiar. He waited. An hour later, the crowd began to thicken, the noise rising to a shout. Clara slipped away from the main floor, carrying a pitcher toward the back corridor that led to the private rooms and the storeroom. Elias moved. He did not rush. He simply ghosted through the crowd, a shadow detaching itself from the wall. He followed her into the dim hallway. The noise of the saloon faded slightly here, muffled by the heavy timber walls. She set the pitcher down on a crate and leaned her head against the wall. Closing her eyes for a second, her hand went to her bodice, pressing against something hidden there, a hard, rectangular shape beneath the satin. "Clara," Elias said. She spun around, her movement sharp and fluid. She did not scream. Her hand dropped from her bodice to her side, but she had no weapon. Elias stood 5 feet away, his coat drawn but not raised. He held it loose at his hip, the hammer back. "Don't run," he said. His voice was gravel, low and steady. "I have a warrant." Clara Vance stared at him. Up close, the powder on her face could not hide the dark circles under her eyes or the faint, yellowing bruise on her jawline. She did not look like a stage robber. She looked like a woman who had been walking into a strong wind for a lifetime. "A warrant," she repeated. Her voice was husky, stripped of the false sweetness she used in the main room. "For what?" "The Wells Fargo job. 4 dead." She let out a short, bitter sound that might have been a laugh. "You think I robbed a stagecoach? Look at me, mister. Do I look like I have been riding the high country?" Elias stepped closer. "It does not matter what I think. The paper says you helped set it up. It says you passed word to the gang. $500 says you are coming to Fort Smith." She looked at the gun, then up at his eyes. She did not flinch. Most people begged. They offered money, or lies, or tears. Clara stood straighter. "I did not kill anyone," she said, "but I know who did. And if you take me out of here, I will never make it to Fort Smith. Vane will have me killed before we cross the county line." Elias frowned. "Silas Vane?" She nodded toward the main room. "He owns this town. He owns the sheriff. And he owns me. That is a matter for the judge," Elias said, though the doubt was already worming its way into his gut. "Turn around. Hands where I can see them." She did not turn. Instead, she took a step toward him. The desperation he had sensed earlier was gone, replaced by a terrifying calm. She looked at the gun barrel, then met his gaze with a challenge that hit him harder than a fist. "Shoot me," she said. Elias blinked. "What? Shoot me if you want freedom," she said. Her voice was steady, but tears of pure rage welled in her eyes. "Go on. Pull the trigger. Collect your $500 for a corpse. It would be a kindness." She took another step, pressing her chest almost against the barrel of the Colt. "Death is the only way I get out of this contract," she whispered. "I am tired of being sold, Cowboy. I am tired of being afraid, so you either shoot me and save me the trouble, or you get out of my way." Elias lowered the gun. He could not help it. He had seen fear in 1,000 eyes. But he had never seen this, a total, devastating surrender of hope. He looked at her wrists and saw the raw red marks where rope or leather had chafed them. He saw the way she trembled, not from cowardice, but from the sheer effort of holding herself together. She was not a villain. She was a woman cornered by wolves, and he was just another set of teeth. "I am not going to kill you," Elias said, easing the hammer of the Colt down. "Then leave," she said, her voice cracking. "Leave before they find you here." Before Elias could answer, the door at the end of the hallway burst open. 2 men filled the frame, It was the hired muscle he had seen flanking Silas Vane, the larger one. A man with a beard like steel wool and a shotgun, explicitly leveled at Elias, grinned. "Well now," the big man said. "Look what we have here. Jimmy, a rat in the pantry." Clara gasped, stepping back, her hand flying to her mouth. "Biggs, please! He was just—" "Shut your mouth, Clara," Biggs snapped. "Mr. Vane wants a word, and he wants to know why you are chatting with strangers when you still owe on your contract." "He is a bounty hunter," Clara said quickly, trying to shield Elias with her words. "He has a warrant. He is federal." Biggs laughed. "A warrant? In Granite Creek, the only law is what Mr. Vane writes in his ledger, and according to that ledger, you belong to the house until your debt is paid. That means $3,000. Girl, you are property." The word hung in the air, heavy and ugly. Property. Elias felt the change in the air. This was not an arrest. This was a retrieval. The warrant in his pocket felt suddenly heavy. A lie written on paper. If he handed her over to these men, she would disappear. The robbery, the massacre. It was a frame. He saw it clearly now. Vane needed a scapegoat for the law, or perhaps she knew too much, and the warrant was just a way to flush her out so she could be silenced. Elias looked at Clara. She was staring at the shotgun, her face drained of blood. She looked small. "Drop the iron, cowboy," Biggs said, racking the slide of the shotgun. Elias looked at Biggs. He looked at the narrow corridor. He looked at the side door 5 feet to his left, barred with a simple wooden plank. Mercy is a weakness, he told himself. Mercy gets you killed. But looking at Clara Vance, standing proud and terrified in her blue satin, Elias knew he could not walk away. He had lost his wife. He had lost his daughter. He had failed to protect everything that mattered. He would not fail this. Elias dropped his left hand as if to surrender, then snapped his right wrist up. He didn't shoot Biggs. The shotgun was already leveled. Instead, Elias fired into the oil lamp hanging from the low ceiling. The glass shattered. Burning oil rained down between them and the enforcers, creating a curtain of sudden, roaring fire. Biggs shouted, firing the shotgun blindly. The buckshot tore into the wall inches from Elias's head, sending splinters flying. "Run!" Elias roared. He grabbed Clara's arm, his grip bruising hard, and hurled her toward the side door. He kicked the wooden bar upward, shattering the dry timber, and threw his shoulder against the wood. The door flew open, spilling them out into the cold, muddy alley behind the saloon. "My horse!" Clara cried, "stumbling in the mud. I cannot leave. There is no time." Elias grabbed her waist and practically threw her toward the end of the alley where he had seen the livery. But the shouts were already rising from inside the saloon. The fire would not hold them for long. They sprinted through the muck, the cold air burning their lungs. Elias reached the livery stable, startling the boy who was sleeping on a hay bale. "Saddle the roan!" Elias shouted, throwing the boy another coin. "And get a horse for the lady. Now, we have to go double," Elias corrected himself. Realizing a second saddle would take too long, he vaulted onto the roan mare, the leather creaking, and reached down. Clara hesitated for a heartbeat. She looked back toward the saloon, where smoke was beginning to curl from the back door. She touched her bodice again, ensuring whatever she carried was safe. Then she looked at the young girl, Rose, who had appeared at the back door of the kitchen, watching with wide eyes. Clara made a hand sign, a quick, desperate gesture to stay hidden. Then she took Elias's hand. He swung her up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her grip terrified and tight. She smelled of cheap lavender water and fear. "Hold on," Elias grated out. He spurred the mare. The horse lunged forward, sensing the urgency. They thundered out of the livery, hooves striking sparks on the few stones in the mud. Shots rang out behind them. A bullet whined past Elias's ear like an angry hornet. He did not look back. He guided the mare hard to the left, away from the main road, cutting between the tents and shanties, heading for the open scrubland. They hit the edge of town and did not slow down. The lights of Granite Creek faded behind them, swallowed by the darkness. The wind hit them with renewed force, howling across the open plain. It was a bitter, freezing wind that promised snow before morning. Elias pushed the horse until the town was just aglow on the horizon, then slowed to a trot to save the animal's strength. The silence of the wilderness wrapped around them, vast and indifferent. Coyotes yipped in the distance, a lonely, hunger-filled sound. They were out in the black, with no supplies, one horse, and a powerful enemy waking up behind them. Elias had just traded a $500 reward for a price on his own head. He felt Clara shivering against his back. She pressed her face into his sheepskin coat to escape the wind. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Why did you do that?" Elias looked ahead at the dark shape of the mountains. He didn't have a good answer. Or maybe he did, and he just wasn't ready to say it. "Because you were right," Elias said into the dark. "Right about what? Freedom," he said. "It is not something you ask for. It is something you take." He urged the horse forward, deeper into the night. The trail ahead was invisible, hidden by sagebrush and shadow. But there was no turning back. They were outlaws now, bound together by a split-second choice and the cold barrel of a gun. And the winter was coming fast. The sun rose like a bruised eye over the eastern rim of the basin, shedding a pale, heatless light that did nothing to cut the biting frost. The land here was vast and skeletal, a sweeping expanse of gray sagebrush and black volcanic rock that seemed to go on forever, broken only by the thin, silver ribbons of freezing creeks that cut through the dust. Elias Thorne kept the roan mare at a steady, ground-eating walk. They had been riding for hours, the silence between them as heavy as the leaden sky. Clara sat behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist not out of affection but out of the sheer necessity of staying mounted on a weary animal. Every step the horse took jarred Elias's spine, but he did not complain. He focused on the horizon, scanning for the telltale dust of pursuit, though the frozen ground would hide their tracks well enough for now. They passed the skeleton of a homestead around mid-morning. It was a pitiful thing, a collapsed sod roof and 3 walls of timber that had grayed and split in the sun. A broken wagon wheel lay half buried in the dirt like the bone of some extinct beast. Elias pulled the mare up. "We need to rest the horse," he said, his voice rough from the dry air. "She is carrying double weight. If she goes lame, we are dead." Clara slid down from the saddle. Her blue satin dress, so vibrant in the gilded spur, was now stained with mud and snagged by brambles. She shivered violently as her boots hit the frozen earth, wrapping her arms around herself. She looked at the ruined house, her eyes dark and unreadable. "People lived here once," she said softly. Elias dismounted and began to loosen the cinch to let the mare breathe. "They tried to. This country does not like people much. It tolerates us for a while. Then it breaks us." Clara walked toward the ruin. She reached out and touched the rough wood of the doorframe. There was a rusted tin cup sitting on a rotting sill, left behind as if the owner intended to come back for it. "Hope dies easy out here," she said. It sounds like she was talking about the house, but Elias knew she wasn't. He watched her. The adrenaline of the escape had faded, leaving behind the stark reality of who they were. A bounty hunter who had broken the law, and a woman who was technically a fugitive. He saw the way she held herself, shoulders tight, chin slightly tucked. She was waiting for him to turn on her. In her world, men were transaction and threat, never shelter. He walked over to her, offering his canteen. "It is water, not whiskey." She took it, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was ice cold. She drank deeply, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Why?" she asked again. It was the same question she had asked in the dark, but now, in the light of day, it demanded a real answer. "You could have turned me in. You could have taken the $500. Why are we standing in the middle of nowhere with a half-dead horse instead?" Elias looked at the horizon. "Because I looked at the warrant again in my head. It said you aided a robbery. But when I looked at you, I saw a woman who was afraid to speak, not a woman who was cutting deals with road agents." "And that is it?" she challenged, her eyes flashing. A hunch. Elias shook his head. No, it was the men Vane sent. They did not want to arrest you, Clara. They wanted to collect you. A man does not bring a shotgun to a conversation unless he plans to end it permanently. I figured if I handed you over, you would be dead before sundown. Clara laughed. A sharp, brittle sound. Dead would be peaceful. You do not know Silas Vane. He would not kill me. Not right away. He would make an example of me. He likes to show the other girls what happens when you try to leave the life. She turned away, looking out at the endless scrub. You think you saved me, cowboy? All you did was prolong the inevitable. Elias stepped closer. Tell me about the debt, he said. Biggs said you owed $3,000. How does a saloon girl run up a tab like that? Clara spun around, her face twisting with a sudden, fierce anger. You think I drank it? You think I gambled it away? I am asking, Elias said gently. She paced away from him, her satin skirts rustling in the dry grass. I was 18. My father was a miner in Silverton. The shaft collapsed. They gave my mother $10 and told us to clear out of the company housing. We had nowhere to go. We drifted south. Mother got sick, consumption. The doctor said, the medicine cost money. The room cost money. She stopped, staring at the ground. Vane found me when I was trying to sell my mother's locket. He was charming then. He said he had work. He said I could sing in the hall. He loaned me $50 for a dress and a room. I thought he was a saint. She looked up at Elias, her expression hard. Then the rent went up. Then he charged me for the food. Then he charged me for the protection. Every week. I worked 7 nights and every week. The ledger showed I owed him more than I earned. It is a trap. Elias, it is a deep, black well with greased walls. You climb until your fingernails bleed, and he just kicks you back down. Elias felt a cold knot in his stomach. He knew the world was hard, but this was a different kind of cruelty. It was a machine designed to grind people into dust. So the contract is a lie. He said, it is legal enough for the sheriff, she said bitterly. And now you are part of it. You are a thief of property. I have been called worse, Elias said. He walked back to the mare and tightened the cinch. We need to move. The wind is changing. There is weather coming down from the peaks. They mounted up again. The physical contact feeling different this time. Before, it was just survival. Now, Elias was acutely aware of the woman behind him, of the heat of her body against his back, of the terrible weight of the story she carried. He felt a protective urge rising in him, something he hadn't felt since before the fever took his family. It terrified him. The storm hit them 2 hours later. It did not start with snow, but with a drop in temperature so sudden it felt like a physical blow. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind began to scream, tearing at their clothes and stinging their faces with grit. Then came the snow, hard, dry pellets that drove sideways, blinding them. Elias pulled his hat low and squinted against the gale. He knew this country. A man could freeze to death in an hour out here if he lost his way. He guided the mare toward a ridge of jagged rocks, hoping for a windbreak. There! Clara shouted close to his ear. Through the swirling white, Elias saw the outline of a structure. It was a line shack, used by cattlemen in the summer to check the herds. It was small, low to the ground, and built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. He spurred the mare toward it. They reached the leeward side of the shack, the wind instantly dropping to a dull roar. Elias slid off and helped Clara down. Her legs buckled when she hit the ground, numb with cold. He caught her, holding her upright for a moment. Inside! He yelled over the wind. Get inside. He led the horse into the small lean-to attached to the back of the shack, thankful to find a pile of dry hay. He stripped the saddle off the mare and rubbed her down quickly with a handful of straw, covering her with the saddle blanket. When he entered the shack, Clara was standing in the center of the dark room, shivering so hard her teeth chattered. The place was barely 10 feet by 10 feet, with a stone fireplace and a single bunk built into the wall. It smelled of wood smoke and old dust. Elias moved quickly. He found a stack of dry wood in the corner and some tinder. Within minutes, he had a fire crackling in the hearth. The light danced on the walls, pushing back the gloom. "Come here," he said. "Get close to the heat." Clara moved toward the fire, sinking to her knees on the hearthstones. She held her hands out, her fingers pale and waxy. Elias knelt beside her. He saw a cut on her wrist, likely from the rough wood of the saloon door when they fled. It was bleeding sluggishly. "Let me see that," he said. He took her hand. His own hands were rough, calloused from years of rope and rain, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He used a splash of water from his canteen and a clean strip of cloth from his saddlebag to bind the cut. Clara watched him. The firelight flickered on his face, softening the harsh lines around his eyes and mouth. He was focused, efficient, treating her not like a prize or a problem, but like a human being who was hurt. The silence in the shack deepened, heavy with the howling wind outside. The forced closeness was suffocating and electric all at once. They were alone, miles from civilization, trapped in a box of warmth while the world froze outside. Elias finished tying the bandage. He looked up and found her watching him. Her eyes were wide, the pupils dilated in the dim light. Her breathing was shallow. He did not let go of her hand. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them seemed to vibrate. Elias felt a sudden, sharp pull in his chest, a longing he had thought dead and buried. He wanted to pull her close, not to possess her, but to comfort her, to hold back the cold and the fear that radiated off her in waves. He saw the same hunger in her eyes, a desperate need for connection that warred with her ingrained suspicion. Clara's gaze dropped to his mouth, then back to his eyes. She pulled her hand away slowly, as if breaking a physical thread. "Do not look at me like that," she whispered. "Like what?" Elias asked, his voice low. "Like you want to save me," she said. She hugged her knees to her chest. "Men who try to save me get hurt, or they realize I am not worth the trouble and they turn into the thing I ran from." "I am not vain," Elias said. "No," she said, and her voice trembled. "You are worse, because you make me want to believe you, and that will destroy you. Elias, Vane will tear this country apart to find me. He has the money and the men." "If you stay with me, you will end up dead in a ditch." Elias poked the fire with a stick, watching the sparks fly up the chimney. "I have been dead for 2 years. Clara, I am just walking around out of habit." He looked at her, his jaw set in a line of stubborn determination. "I am not doing this to be a hero. I am doing it because I don't like being used as a weapon. Vane handed me a warrant and told me to fetch his property. I decided I didn't like the job. That is all. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't poetry. It was the flat, hard truth of a man who had drawn a line in the dirt. And that made it more dangerous than any promise of undying love. It meant he wouldn't quit when the romance faded or the bullets started flying." Clara looked at him, and for the first time, the guard in her eyes slipped completely. She looked terrified. Not of Vane, but of the hope Elias was offering her. "You are a fool," she said softly. "Likely." Elias agreed. He stood up and moved to the other side of the fire, putting distance between them. "Get some sleep. The storm will break by morning. We have a long ride, back in Granite Creek." The storm was just rain, turning the streets into a slurry of freezing mud. Sheriff Grady stood in the doorway of the gilded spur, water dripping from the brim of his hat. Inside, Silas Vane sat at his usual table, but the atmosphere was far from festive. The piano was silent. The girls were gone. Biggs stood by the bar, his arm in a sling where a splinter from the doorframe had gouged him. "He is a kidnapper," Vane said calmly. He was shuffling a deck of cards, the sound rhythmic and sharp. "That is the story. Grady. Elias Thorne came into my establishment, waved a gun, and dragged Miss Vance out against her will. He likely plans to hold her for ransom or use her for unsavory purposes." Grady shifted uncomfortably. "Thorne is a licensed bounty hunter. Silas, he had a warrant. Folks saw it." "The warrant was for questioning," Vane said, not looking up. "It did not authorize him to shoot up my bar and abduct a woman. He has gone rogue. The drought drove him mad. It happens." Vane slapped the deck down on the table and looked up. His eyes were cold and dead. "Gather a posse. Sheriff, Deputize my men. Biggs will lead them. I want you to hunt him down like the dog he is." "And the girl?" Grady asked. Vane picked up his whiskey glass. "If she is with him, she is an accomplice, or a hostage caught in the crossfire. It does not matter. Just bring me the ledger she stole, and bring me Thorne's body." The morning broke clear and painfully cold. The sun reflected off the fresh snow, creating a blinding white glare. Elias and Clara rode out early. The mare rested but hungry. They moved south, aiming for the timber line where they could find cover. The tension from the night before had shifted into a quiet, fragile understanding. Clara didn't hold on quite as tightly, but she didn't pull away when he helped her mount. They were a team now, connected by the secret of the night and the danger of the day. By noon, they reached Coyote Creek. The water was running high and black, fringed with ice. The crossing was narrow, a ford between two steep banks choked with willows. Elias halted the mare at the edge of the trees. He scanned the opposite bank. It was quiet, too quiet. A crow called out, a harsh, grating sound. "Something is wrong," Elias murmured. Before he could turn the horse, the crack of a rifle shattered the air. The bullet struck the ground inches from the mare's front hooves. Spraying snow and dirt, the horse reared, screaming. Elias fought the reins, keeping them from toppling. "There!" A shout from the ridge across the creek. "That is the kidnapper! Put him down!" Gunfire erupted from the willows on the far bank. Puffs of smoke bloomed against the white snow. "Hold on!" Elias yelled. He spun the mare, driving her hard back toward the tree line they had just left. But a second group of riders emerged from the brush behind them. They were boxed in. It was an ambush. They had tracked them, or guessed their route. Elias saw a narrow gap in the rocks to the west, a goat trail leading up a steep incline. It was their only chance. He kicked the mare into a gallop. Bullets buzzed around them like angry bees. He felt Clara bury her face in his coat. "He is making a run for the ridge. Cut him off!" Elias drew his Colt, firing blindly over his shoulder to keep their heads down. He didn't aim to kill, just to suppress. He guided the mare up the rocky slope, hooves scrambling on the loose shale. A rifle shot rang out, clearer and closer than the others. Elias felt a sudden, massive impact in his upper left arm. It felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. The force of it nearly knocked him out of the saddle. He gritted his teeth, a groan escaping his lips. His left arm went numb, useless. He grabbed the horn with his right hand, steering with his knees. "Elias!" Clara screamed, seeing the blood soak through his sheepskin coat. "Keep your head down," he roared. They crested the ridge, the mare surging with a final burst of panic and strength. They plunged down the other side, sliding into a ravine filled with dense pine. The gunfire continued, but the bullets struck the rocks behind them. They were out of the line of sight. Elias kept them moving, winding through the trees, putting distance between them and the posse. He could feel the warm, wet spread of blood down his sleeve. The numbness was fading, replaced by a searing, white-hot pain. He rode until his vision began to blur at the edges. Finally, they reached a shallow cave hidden by a fallen boulder, miles from the crossing. Elias slid from the saddle, his legs refusing to hold him. He hit the ground hard. Clara was there instantly. She didn't panic. She didn't scream. She grabbed him under his good arm and dragged him into the shelter of the cave. She worked with a terrifying efficiency. She tore a strip from her petticoat, packing snow into it to make a compress. She cut away his heavy coat and the shirt beneath, revealing the ugly, angry hole in his bicep. The bullet had passed through. Thank God. But it had torn muscle and missed the bone by a fraction of an inch. She pressed the snowpack against the wound. Elias hissed through his teeth, his head falling back against the stone. "Stay with me," Clara said, her voice fierce. "Do not you dare die on me, Elias Thorne." She tied the bandage tight, her hands moving with a tenderness that belied her sharp words. She brushed the hair back from his sweating forehead. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Why did you take the hit? You could have thrown me off. You could have surrendered." Elias opened his eyes. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the tears tracking through the dirt on her face. He saw the fear, but he also saw the strength. "Because," he rasped, "you are worth more than the debt." Clara froze. She looked at him, her hands hovering over his chest. Then, slowly, she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder, careful of the wound. "I lied," she whispered. Elias blinked, trying to focus. "About what?" "I did not just hear about the robbery," she said. "I was there." Elias went still. "I was in the coach," Clara said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Vane sent me to deliver a package to a partner in the next town. I was inside when the gang hit. They did not just want the strongbox. Elias, they wanted the judge. Judge Miller. He was a passenger." She lifted her head, her eyes haunted. "Vane ordered the hit. Miller was going to indict him for land fraud and racketeering. The robbery was a cover to assassinate a federal judge. I saw Biggs shoot him." "I saw everything." She took a ragged breath. "That is why they want me back. That is why they are hunting us. It is not about the money. It is not about the contract. I am the only witness who can hang Silas Vane." Elias closed his eyes as the realization washed over him. It wasn't just corruption. It wasn't just a bad town. It was a conspiracy that went all the way to the federal bench. The posse wasn't law enforcement. It was a death squad. He looked at the woman beside him. She was shivering, terrified, and small, but she was holding the key to bringing down an empire. "We are not going to run anymore," Elias whispered. Clara looked at him, confused. "What?" "We are going to the railhead," he said, his voice gaining a fraction of strength. "We're going to find a marshal who is not on Vane's payroll, and you are going to tell him everything. But they will kill us." She said. "They are going to try," Elias said. He reached up with his good hand and took hers. "But they made a mistake." "What mistake?" "They let us live," Elias said. "And now we are going to make them regret it." The wind outside the cave howled, carrying the promise of a long, hard winter. But inside, amidst the pain and the fear, a new kind of fire had been lit. It was the fire of two people who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The land rose beneath them, shedding the scrubby desolation of the basin for the hard, unforgiving granite of the high plains. Here, the world felt stripped of all softness. The wind did not just blow, it hunted. It sought the gaps in their clothing, the seams of their resolve, and the heat in their blood. Elias Thorne rode with his left arm bound tight against his chest. The bullet wound was a dull, throbbing sun in the center of his awareness, pulsing in time with the mare's hoofbeats. Every jar of the saddle sent a fresh spike of white sickness through his stomach, but he kept his face set like flint. To show pain was to invite worry, and Clara Vance carried enough weight already. They were heading north toward Ironwood, a railhead town perched on the edge of the territory. Rumors said a federal marshal held court there, a man named Sterling who had a reputation for hanging men who thought their money put them above the law. It was a thin hope, fragile as the ice forming on the darker pools of the creek, but it was all they had. Clara sat behind him, her body pressed against his back for warmth. The heat of her was the only thing keeping the numbness from taking his spine completely. They had been riding for 3 days since the ambush at Coyote Creek, moving through a landscape that grew bleaker with every mile. The sky was a flat sheet of iron, promising snow that refused to fall, holding the cold in a suffocating embrace. "We need supplies," Elias said. His voice was rough, scraped raw by the dry air. Clara shifted. "There is a settlement ahead. I saw the smoke from the ridge. It is risky," Elias said. "Starving is risky too," she countered. "The horse needs grain, Elias, and you need clean bandages. That rag is stiff with blood." He knew she was right. They turned the exhausted mare toward the thin plume of smoke that marked civilization in this emptiness. The settlement was hardly a town. It was a cluster of buildings huddled against the wind, a trading post, a blacksmith, and a few scattered houses that looked like they were bracing for a blow. They rode in slowly. Elias kept his hat low, his right hand resting near the butt of his Colt. People watched them. It was the kind of place where strangers were events, and usually bad ones. A woman beating a rug on a porch stopped mid-swing, her eyes narrowing as she took in Clara's dress. The blue satin, once the pride of the gilded spur, was now a ruin of mud stains and torn lace. It was a garment that spoke of the night, of sin, and of places decent folk did not go. Elias felt Clara stiffen against him. She sat straighter, lifting her chin, but he could feel the tremble in her frame. It was not the cold. It was the shame. The town's judgment hit her harder than the wind. They pulled up at the trading post. Elias dismounted first, his legs stiff. He reached up to help Clara down. When her boots hit the dirt, she smoothed her skirts with a gesture that was heartbreakingly dignified. "Wait here with the horse," Elias said quietly. "No," Clara said, "I am not a dog to be tied outside." She walked toward the door, her head high. Elias followed, his eyes scanning the street. The inside of the store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and kerosene. It was warm, a welcome relief that made Elias's skin prickle. The proprietor, a balding man with spectacles, looked up from the counter. Two women were browsing a bolt of calico in the corner. They turned, and the silence that fell over the room was absolute. The women's eyes raked over Clara. They looked at the bare shoulders exposed by the torn bodice, the painted face that the trail had only half scrubbed clean, and the way she held herself. They did not see a survivor. They saw a disease. One of the women gathered her skirts, pulling them close as if Clara's shadow might stain the fabric. "Come, Martha," she said, her voice loud in the quiet room. "The air in here has turned foul." They swept past Clara, their noses high. One of them muttered a word under her breath, "whore," that landed like a slap. Clara did not flinch, but Elias saw the color drain from her face. She stared at a row of canned peaches. Her jaw locked so tight a muscle jumped in her cheek. She was used to the cruelty of men. That was a physical threat. But the cruelty of these women, the judgment of the respectable world she had been exiled from, cut deeper. It confirmed her worst fear, that no matter how far she ran, she would always be the woman from the gilded spur. The shopkeeper cleared his throat. "We do not want trouble here. Mr. Best you take your companion and move along." Elias walked to the counter. He moved with a slow, dangerous grace. He placed a gold coin on the wood. It was his last one. "I want grain for my horse." He said, "I want beans, coffee, and a bottle of iodine. And I want a heavy wool dress, something warm." The shopkeeper looked at the coin, then at Elias's eyes. He saw something there that made him swallow his next words. He nodded quickly and began to gather the items. Elias turned to Clara. He did not look at the women who were watching through the window. He looked only at her. "Pick a dress," he said. Clara looked at him. "I cannot," she whispered. "Elias, they are staring." "Let them stare," he said. His voice was low, but it carried a steel weight. "You are not what they think you are. You are the reason I am still breathing. Now pick a dress. Clara, a blue one. It suits you." She looked at him, startled. For a moment, the shame in her eyes warred with something else, surprise, and the beginnings of gratitude. She reached out and touched a rough wool dress of dark indigo. "This one," she said softly. When they walked out, Elias carried the supplies, but he made sure to walk beside her. Not in front of her. He placed his body between her and the town, a silent wall against their scorn. He was ruined in their eyes too, a man who consorted with fallen women, but he found he did not care. The opinion of the world meant very little compared to the way Clara had tied his bandage in the cave. They rode until the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised orange. They made camp in a small depression shielded by a stand of twisted juniper trees. It was not much, but it broke the wind. Elias tended to the horse while Clara changed into the wool dress behind the trees. When she emerged, she looked transformed. The practical fabric swallowed her silhouette, hiding the curves the satin had accentuated. She looked less like a saloon girl and more like a woman of the plains, hardened and enduring. She bundled the blue satin into a ball. "Burn it," Elias said, building a small fire. Clara looked at the dress in her hands. She hesitated. It was a badge of her slavery. Yes, but it was also the only thing she had owned for 3 years. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, she threw it onto the kindling. The satin caught quickly. The lace curled and blackened. The fire roared up, consuming the last vestige of the gilded spur. "Good riddance," she said. They sat by the fire, eating beans from a tin cup. The warmth of the flames created a small, intimate circle in the vast darkness. For the first time in days, the tension that hummed between them relaxed. Clara watched Elias struggle to roll a cigarette with one hand. She reached over, taking the papers and tobacco from him. Her fingers were deft. She rolled it perfectly, licked the paper, and handed it to him. "You have useful hands," Elias said, taking it. "I learned to roll them for Vane," she said. He liked his tobacco mixed with a little clove. He said it made him feel civilized while he was robbing miners blind. She paused, looking into the fire. Then, a small, rusty sound escaped her throat. It was a laugh. "What is funny?" Elias asked. "I was just thinking about the look on that woman's face in the store." Clara said, "She looked like she had swallowed a lemon whole. And you looked like you were ready to shoot the jars of pickles off the shelf." "I do not like pickles," Elias said deadpan. Clara laughed again, and this time the sound was clearer, less jagged. It changed her face. The lines of strain around her mouth smoothed out. In the firelight, with the wool dress and the loose hair, she was beautiful. Not the painted artificial beauty of the saloon, but something raw and real. Elias felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his wound. He wanted to reach out and touch her cheek, to see if she was as warm as she looked, but he held back. He knew that for a woman like Clara, touch had always been a transaction or a violation. He would not take what was not offered. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her voice serious. "For the dress? For the dignity?" She said, "No one has stood up for me without wanting something in return since I was 16. I want something," Elias said. Clara stiffened slightly, her old instincts flaring. "What? I want to know the rest," he said. "You said Vane ordered the hit on Judge Miller, but a judge is a big target. Why take the risk? What is in the ledger?" "Clara," she looked at him, searching his face for any sign of deceit. She found only patience. She reached into the pocket of her new dress and pulled out a folded, leather-bound notebook. It was small, innocent-looking. "It is not just debts," she said, opening it. "It is land claims." She pointed to a page covered in Vane's cramped handwriting. "See these names? These are the miners who died in accidents over the last 2 years. And these dates? These are the dates their widows signed over their deeds to Vane for pennies on the dollar." She turned the page. "And this is the route for the new railroad spur. Judge Miller was coming to file the federal survey. If the railroad goes through the valley, this land becomes worth millions. Vane knows the route. He has been buying up the land along the tracks before anyone else knows. He is stealing the whole territory. Elias. And he is killing anyone who gets in the way." Elias took the book. He saw the pattern instantly. It was a map of greed drawn in blood. Vane wasn't just a saloon owner. He was a kingpin building a kingdom on the bones of the poor. "This hangs him," Elias said softly. "This hangs the sheriff too." "Yes," Clara said. "If we get it to the marshal." "We will," Elias said. He handed the book back to her. His fingers brushed hers. And this time, he did not pull away immediately. He let his hand linger. A silent question. Clara did not pull away either. She looked at his hand, then up at his eyes. The air between them grew heavy, charged with the unspoken pull that had been building since the line shack. "Clara," he started. He was interrupted by the snap of a twig. It was a small sound, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, but to ears tuned to the wild, it sounded like a cannon shot. Elias moved instantly. He kicked dirt over the fire, plunging them into darkness. "Move!" he hissed. Into the trees. He grabbed his rifle with his good hand, ignoring the scream of protest from his injured arm. Clara did not argue. She scrambled back into the darkness of the junipers, clutching the ledger to her chest. Voices drifted from the darkness. Rough, low voices. "I saw the fire. Boss, they are close. Spread out." Vane said he wants the girl alive. But the man is meat. It was the gang, the survivors of the ambush. They had tracked the smoke, just as Clara had feared. Elias pressed his back against a twisted trunk. He could see 3 shapes moving through the gloom, silhouetted against the faint starlight on the snow. They were fanning out, rifles ready. "Stay down," Elias whispered to Clara. He leveled his rifle, resting the barrel on a low branch to steady it. He aimed for the lead shadow. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The lead man dropped with a cry. Chaos erupted. Muzzle flashes lit up the night like lightning. Bullets chewed into the trees around them, sending splinters flying. Elias worked the lever of his rifle, firing again, but his injured arm was slow, clumsy. "Flank him! Go left!" Someone shouted. A figure rushed from the left, closing the distance fast. Elias tried to turn, but his arm locked up in a spasm of agony. He fumbled the rifle. The man was on top of him, a knife glinting in the dark. Elias went down, grappling with his one good hand, trying to hold back the blade that sought his throat. The attacker was heavy, smelling of sweat and stale whiskey. Elias felt his strength failing. Then a shot rang out, close, deafeningly close. The weight on top of him went limp. Elias shoved the body aside and scrambled up. He saw Clara standing 10 feet away. She was holding his Colt revolver, holding it with 2 hands, her feet planted wide. Smoke curled from the barrel. She had not run. She had not hidden. She had stepped into the line of fire and killed the man who was killing him. Behind her, the last gang member, seeing his 2 companions down, decided the bounty was not worth the price. He scrambled for his horse and galloped away into the dark. Silence rushed back into the clearing, louder than the gunfire. Clara stood frozen, the gun still raised. She was shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Elias walked to her. He gently placed his hand over hers on the gun grip, lowering it. "You got him," he said softly. "I killed him," she whispered. Her eyes were wide, staring at the body in the snow. "You saved me," Elias corrected. She looked at him, and the gun slipped from her fingers into the snow. She collapsed against him, burying her face in his chest. Elias wrapped his good arm around her, holding her tight. He could feel her heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird trying to escape. They stood there for a long time, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving them cold and exposed. The reality of what they had done, what they meant to each other, settled over them. "We cannot stay here," Elias said finally. "The one who ran will bring more." They packed quickly, leaving the dead men where they lay. They rode through the night, pushing the mare to her limit, putting miles between them and the graves they had dug. They found shelter just before dawn in a shallow cave near the base of a canyon wall. It was small, cold, and hidden. They collapsed onto the blankets. Elias was gray with exhaustion, his arm bleeding again. Clara tended to him, her hands steady now, though her eyes were dark with shock. When the bandage was tied, she sat back on her heels. The cave was dim, lit only by the gray light of pre-dawn filtering through the entrance. Elias watched her. "You are brave." "Clara, I have known men who would have frozen in that clearing. I was not brave." She said, "I was terrified. I could not watch you die. I could not be alone again." She looked at him, and the raw honesty in her face took his breath away. The barriers were gone. The fear of judgment, the shame of the saloon, the walls she had built, they had all been burned in the fire or shot away in the dark. "Elias," she said. Her voice was a whisper. She moved closer. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the rough stubble on his jaw. "I want you," she said. The words hung in the cold air, stark and simple. Elias's heart slammed against his ribs. He looked at her mouth, then into her eyes. He saw the desire there, hot and undeniable, but he also saw the fear. She was offering herself, but she was terrified that this would be just another transaction. Another time she gave herself to a man who would take what he wanted and leave her with less. "Clara," he said, his voice ragged. "I am afraid," she admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "I am afraid that if I let you love me, I will be weak. I am afraid that you will see me as broken goods. I am afraid that wanting this makes me the whore they say I am." Elias caught her hand. He held it against his chest, over his heart. "Listen to me," he said. "You are not goods. You are not a contract, and you are sure as hell not broken. You are the strongest thing I have ever known." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "If we do this," he said, his voice low and intense, "it is not because I saved you, and it is not because you owe me. I do not own you, Clara. I never will. If you come to me, you come as a free woman. You choose." Clara looked at him. She searched his eyes for any sign of the ownership she had known all her adult life. She found only an open door. He was giving her the one thing she had never had, the power to say yes, which meant nothing without the power to say no. "I choose you," she whispered. She closed the distance. Her lips met his. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of smoke and fear and the fierce, burning hope of survival. It was a collision of two lonely people who had finally found the one place in the wide, empty West where they belonged. Elias kissed her back with everything he had held in check since the moment he saw her in the gilded spur. He kissed her with the hunger of a man who had forgotten what it was to be alive. But even in the heat of it, his hands were gentle. He held her face like it was something precious, something that could not be bought or sold, only cherished. Outside, the snow began to fall, silent and white, covering their tracks and the blood on the ground. Inside the cave, the cold did not matter. They had found the fire, and this time, they would let it burn. The rails of ironwood sang a song of iron and steam that vibrated through the frozen ground long before the town appeared through the gray mist. It was a sound of progress, loud and unyielding, a stark contrast to the silence of the high plains Elias and Clara had just survived. They rode into the railhead town under the cover of a slate-gray afternoon. Ironwood was bigger than Granite Creek, built of brick and dressed stone rather than green timber and canvas. It smelled of coal smoke and money. The train station dominated the center of town, a cathedral to the new god of the West, with locomotives hissing steam like tethered dragons. Elias kept the mare at a walk. His left arm was stiff, bound tight against his ribs, but the fever had broken. He felt the sharp clarity that comes after sickness. A focus narrowed down to a single point. "We find the marshal," he said, keeping his voice low. "We hand over the ledger. We end this." Clara nodded, but her eyes were darting from face to face in the crowded street. She pulled her shawl tighter. The wool dress Elias had bought her was respectable, but she wore it like a costume. Underneath, she was still waiting for the trap to snap shut. They tied the horse near the courthouse, a formidable brick building with the stars and stripes hanging limp in the freezing air. Elias adjusted his coat to hide his colt, but he could not hide the way he walked, like a wolf trying to pass for a dog. They made it to the steps of the courthouse when the doors opened. It was not Marshal Sterling who stepped out. It was a man in a black suit, holding a leather satchel, flanked by 4 men wearing deputies' badges. But these were not the rough-hewn lawmen of the mining camps. They were clean-shaven, cold-eyed men who looked like they followed orders without asking questions. The man in the suit stopped. He adjusted his spectacles and looked down at a paper in his hand, then at Clara. "Clara Vance," the man said. His voice was dry, like rustling paper. Clara froze. Elias stepped in front of her, his hand hovering near his gun. "Who is asking?" Elias growled. "My name is Arthur Pym," the man said. "I represent the commercial interests of Mr. Silas Vane, and I am here to execute a writ of reclamation for stolen property and unpaid debt." He gestured to the deputies. "Take her." Elias drew his Colt. The movement was a blur, faster than a wounded man should have been. He leveled it at Pym's chest. "Touch her and you die," Elias said. The deputies drew their weapons, 4 guns leveled at Elias. The street cleared instantly, pedestrians scattering into alleys. Pym did not flinch. He looked at Elias with a bored expression. "Put the gun down. Mr. Thorne, this is not a mining camp. This is Ironwood. We have laws here. I have a signed contract and a warrant from the county judge. Miss Vance is in breach of contract. She owes $3,000. Until that debt is paid. She is the legal custodial ward of the Gilded Spur. She is a witness in a federal murder case," Elias said, his voice tight. "We are here to see Marshal Sterling. Marshal Sterling is currently riding circuit in the southern counties," Pym said smoothly. "He will not be back for 2 weeks. In his absence, the local sheriff enforces the writs." Pym nodded to the deputies. "If he fires, kill him. If he surrenders, arrest him for brandishing a firearm in city limits." Elias looked at the 4 guns. He looked at Clara. He could shoot Pym. He might even get one of the deputies. But he would be dead before he hit the ground, and Clara would be alone in the hands of these men. Violence was the language he knew best, but it was a language that would get them both killed today. "Don't," Clara whispered. Elias looked back at her. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "Do not die for this. Elias," she said, "not here, not like this." She stepped out from behind him. She walked down the stairs, her hands held out. "I am coming," she said to Pym. "Tell your dogs to stand down." "Clara!" Elias shouted, the agony in his voice cutting through the cold air. She did not look back. Pym nodded, and 2 of the deputies grabbed her arms. Rough and efficient, they marched her toward the jailhouse adjacent to the court. Pym looked at Elias, who stood shaking with the effort of not pulling the trigger. "You are a lucky man, Mr. Thorne," Pym said. "You get to walk away. I suggest you keep walking. If you are still in Ironwood at sundown, I will have you hanged for vagrancy." The jail door slammed shut with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Elias stood alone on the courthouse steps, the cold wind biting into his wound. He had brought her here to save her. Instead, he had delivered her straight into the cage. The rage that rose in him was black and suffocating. He wanted to burn the town down. He wanted to kick the jail door off its hinges and slaughter every man wearing a badge. But then he remembered the ledger. He remembered the plan. And he remembered that Clara had walked away to save his life. He holstered his gun. He turned and walked away from the jail, his boots crunching on the frost-covered brick. He would not give them the satisfaction of a fair fight. He headed toward the rail yards. The section of town where the track workers lived was a different world. It was a maze of shanties and boarding houses, smelling of coal dust and cabbage. Elias found Marcus huddled by a brazier near the water tower, warming his hands. Marcus was a giant of a man, his skin the color of deep obsidian, his shoulders broad from swinging a sledgehammer for 10 hours a day. He had been a buffalo soldier before the railroad took his knees, and he knew Elias from a cattle drive 5 years ago. "Elias?" Marcus squinted through the smoke. "You look like you have been chewed up by a thresher. I need a favor." "Marcus," Elias said, stepping into the warmth of the fire. Marcus looked at the blood on Elias's coat, then at his eyes. "This sounds like the kind of favor that gets a man fired. Or shot." "They took her," Elias said. "Vane's lawyer. They have her in the county lockup. They're going to ship her back to Granite Creek on the morning train." Marcus spat into the fire. "The law in this town is bought and paid for. Elias, you know that. A black man gets near that jail. He does not come out. I do not need you to break her out," Elias said. "I need you to stop a train." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Stop a train? I need a distraction." Elias said, "A big one." He laid out the plan. It was desperate. It was thin, and it relied on timing that was nearly impossible. But Marcus listened. He listened because he knew what it was like to be judged by the color of your skin or the money in your pocket. He listened because he saw the way Elias spoke about the woman, not as property, but as a lifeline. "I am in," Marcus said finally. "But we need a place to hide her once she is out. The sheriff will tear this town apart. I know a place," a voice said from the shadows. Elias spun, his hand going to his gun. A woman stepped into the light. She was older, wearing a severe gray dress and a bonnet that had seen better days. Her face was lined with hardship, but her eyes were sharp and clear. "Mrs. Holloway," Elias said, recognizing her. She ran the mission shelter on the edge of town, a place where battered women went when they had nowhere else. Elias had brought a girl there once, years ago, after a raid on a brothel. "I saw what happened at the courthouse," Mrs. Holloway said. "I saw that lawyer, Pim. He is a snake. He tried to shut my shelter down last month because we sat on land the railroad wanted." She looked at Elias. "You are going to get that girl out?" "Tonight," Elias said. "Then bring her to the mission," Mrs. Holloway said. "Under the chapel floor. There is a root cellar. The rats are big, but the sheriff does not know about it." "Why help us?" Elias asked. "Because I know Clara Vance," Mrs. Holloway said. "Or I knew girls like her. And because I believe that sometimes the law is a sin, and breaking it is a prayer." Inside the jail, the cell was a box of stone and iron. It was cleaner than the one in Granite Creek, but that only made it colder. Clara sat on the narrow cot. She had not moved for an hour. The deputy on guard was a young man named Kincaid. He sat at the desk, trying to read a penny dreadful, but he kept glancing at her. He looked uncomfortable. "You want some water, miss?" Kincaid asked finally. Clara looked at him. She saw the hesitation in his eyes. He was not like Pim. He was just a boy with a badge he probably did not understand. "I want to know how much they paid you," Clara said quietly. Kincaid flushed. "I do not know what you mean. You are a fugitive. It is the law." "The law?" Clara stood up and walked to the bars. She gripped the cold iron. "Do you know what is in the ledger I carry, deputy?" Kincaid blinked. "What ledger?" "The one Pim is so desperate to find. The one that proves your sheriff takes money from murderers. The one that proves Judge Miller was assassinated to clear the way for land grabs." Kincaid put the book down. "That is crazy talk, is it?" Clara leaned closer. "Ask yourself why Pim is here. Ask yourself why a high-priced lawyer came all the way to this freezing town for a $3,000 debt. I am a loose end, deputy, and if you hold me here, you are part of the knot." Kincaid looked at her, then at the door. He looked scared. "I am just doing my job," he muttered. "Your job is about to get a lot harder," Clara said, "because Elias Thorne is not going to leave me here. And when he comes back, you do not want to be standing on the wrong side of the door." She sat back down. She had planted the seed. Now she had to wait. But as the hours dragged on and the sun went down, the cold doubt began to creep in. Why would he come back? The voice in her head, the one that sounded like Silas Vane, whispered to her, "He is a man. Men survive. He saw the guns. He saw the odds. He did the math. You are $3,000 of trouble. Clara, he is halfway to the territory line by now." She pulled her knees to her chest. It made sense. It was the logic of the world she had lived in for years. Love was a pretty word people used to hide the transaction. Elias had saved her life. Yes, but to walk into a jailhouse against the law? That was suicide, and Elias was a survivor. She closed her eyes, fighting the sting of tears. She would not cry. She would not let Pim see her break. If this was the end, she would meet it standing up. Midnight struck the town clock. The explosion tore through the silence of the night like a thunderclap. It came from the rail yard, a massive, roaring boom followed by the screech of twisting metal. The ground shook. In the jailhouse, Kincaid jumped to his feet, knocking his chair over. "What in God's name?" Outside, shouts erupted. "Fire! The water tower has blown." The sheriff burst into the office from the street, buttoning his coat. "Kincaid, get down to the yards. The whole platform is going up, but the prisoner—" Kincaid stammered, "I will watch the prisoner. Go!" "We need every hand on the bucket line." Kincaid grabbed his hat and ran out. The sheriff cursed, grabbing a shotgun from the rack. He looked at Clara. "Don't you move," he growled. He stepped out onto the porch to see the fire. The moment he stepped out, a shadow detached itself from the roof of the jailhouse. Elias dropped behind the sheriff. He didn't use his gun. He swung the barrel of the Colt in a tight, brutal arc, striking the sheriff behind the ear. The sheriff crumpled without a sound. Elias caught him before he hit the heavy wood of the porch, dragging him into the shadows. He rifled through the sheriff's pockets until his fingers closed around the heavy brass ring of keys. He burst into the office. Clara was standing at the bars, her face pale as milk. When she saw him, she made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "You came back," she whispered. "I told you," Elias said, jamming the key into the lock. "I do not like pickles." The lock clicked. The door swung open. Clara threw herself at him, burying her face in his neck. He wrapped his good arm around her, lifting her off her feet for a second. "We have to move," he said, putting her down. "The distraction won't last forever." They ran. They did not go to the horses. That was what the sheriff would expect. They ran through the alleys, guided by the flickering light of the distant fire. Marcus had done his job well. The steam boiler he had sabotaged was sending a plume of white smoke hundreds of feet into the air, and half the town was running toward it. They reached the mission shelter on the edge of town. Mrs. Holloway was waiting at the back door. She ushered them inside without a word, leading them through the dark chapel to a small trap door behind the altar. "Down," she whispered. "Stay quiet until I knock 3 times. The root cellar was cramped and smelled of potatoes and earth, but it was warm. Elias lit a small lantern Mrs. Holloway had provided. They sat on the dirt floor, breathing hard. The adrenaline was fading, leaving them shaking. Elias looked at Clara. She was staring at him as if he were a ghost. "You stayed," she said. "I stayed." He answered. "Why?" she asked. The question was raw, stripped of all defense. "I am nothing but trouble. Elias, I am a fugitive. I am penniless. I am—" She stopped, unable to say the word. "You are the woman I love," Elias said. The silence in the cellar was absolute. Clara looked at him, her mouth opening slightly. He had said it. No flowery speech, no hesitation. Just the fact. "You do not have to say it back," Elias said, looking at his hands. "I know you are scared. I know you have been taught that love is just another way to get hurt." Clara moved toward him. She crawled across the small space until she was kneeling in front of him. "I am not scared of you," she whispered. "I am scared of losing this." She reached out and began to unbutton his coat, then his shirt. "What are you doing?" Elias asked, his voice thick. "Checking your bandage," she said softly, "and reclaiming myself." She leaned in and kissed him. This time, it was not the desperate kiss of the cave. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was a question and an answer all at once. In the dim light of the lantern, surrounded by the smell of earth, they came together. It was not a taking. It was a giving. For Clara, every touch was a defiance of her past. Her body was not a commodity to be sold. It was her own, and she was choosing to share it. Elias, mindful of his wound but more mindful of her, moved with a reverence that made Clara weep silently. He touched her scars, the physical ones and the invisible ones, with hands that demanded nothing. He let her set the pace. He let her lead. When they lay together afterwards, covered by his heavy coat, the world above them ceased to exist. There was no Pym, no Vane, no warrants. There was just the steady beat of 2 hearts that had finally found their rhythm. Clara rested her head on his chest. "We cannot run anymore," she said softly. "No," Elias agreed. "If we run, we are just waiting to be caught. Pym will follow us. Vane will send more men." "So what do we do?" Elias asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "We go back," Clara said. Her voice was steel now. "We go back to Granite Creek. That is a death sentence." Elias said. "No," she said. "It is a trial. We have the ledger. We have the truth. We take it to the people. Elias, we take it to the miners who lost their land. We take it to the widows. We put Silas Vane on trial in his own saloon. It is risky." Elias said, "Freedom is risky." She replied. Elias kissed the top of her head. He thought about the miles back to the mining town. He thought about the guns waiting for them. And then he thought about the way she had looked at Pym on the courthouse steps. defiant and unbroken. "You are right," he said. "We go back, and we burn his kingdom to the ground." The next morning, under the cover of a snowstorm that Marcus had predicted, they slipped out of Ironwood. They did not take the main road. They took the old mining track that cut through the high passes, a route that was treacherous in winter but, unwatched, misses. Holloway gave them food. Marcus gave them a fresh horse he had borrowed from the company stock. Kincaid, the young deputy, had left the back gate of the town unlocked, a small act of redemption for a man who had realized he was on the wrong side. As they rode south into the teeth of the wind, the mood was different. They were not fleeing anymore. They were invading. Elias looked at Clara. She rode tall in the saddle, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, burning purpose. She was not the saloon girl anymore. She was not the victim. She was the storm that was coming for Silas Vane. And Elias Thorne, the man who had once thought mercy was a weakness, rode beside her, ready to prove that love was the most dangerous weapon of all. The wind that howled down the main street of Granite Creek was no longer just cold. It was malicious. It carried the bite of deep winter, a freezing razor that scraped against the skin and settled in the bones. The snow was piled high against the timber walls of the buildings. Dirty gray drifts, hardened by frost and coal dust. The town felt smaller, huddled in on itself, a place where secrets were kept frozen and hope was rationed like flour. Elias Thorne and Clara Vance rode in after dark. They did not come as thieves this time. Skulking in the shadows of the alleyways, they rode down the center of the street. The hooves of their horses crunched loud and rhythmic on the packed ice. Elias watched the windows. He saw curtains twitch. He saw the glow of oil lamps dim as people moved to peer out. They were a spectacle. The bounty hunter who had turned outlaw, and the woman who had burned her bridge to the only life she knew. "Are you ready?" Elias asked. His voice was low, lost to the wind for anyone but her. Clara sat tall in the saddle. She wore the heavy wool dress from Ironwood, wrapped in a buffalo robe Elias had bartered for at a trapper's camp 2 days ago. Her face was pale, stripped of the paint and powder that had been her mask for years. She looked severe, beautiful, and terrified. "I am ready," she said. "They did not go to the sheriff's office. That would be a suicide pact. They went to the source of the rot. They went to the Gilded Spur." It was Friday night. The saloon would be packed with miners flush with their weekly pay, drinking to forget the cold and the dark of the shafts. It was the heart of the town, the place where judgments were passed and hierarchies were enforced. Elias dismounted first. His left arm was still stiff, the healing muscle pulling tight with every movement, but he had regained the use of his hand. He tied the mare to the rail, then reached up for Clara. She slid down, her boots hitting the boardwalk with a solid thud. She took a breath, holding the freezing air in her lungs for a moment before exhaling a plume of white steam. She reached into her coat and touched the leather-bound ledger. "Stay close to me," Elias said. "When it starts, it will happen fast." "I know," Clara said. Elias pushed open the batwing doors. The noise inside was a physical wall, a roar of laughter, the clinking of glass, the heavy stamp of boots, and the tinny melody of the piano. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies and spilled beer. Elias stepped in, Clara half a step behind him. It took 10 seconds for the silence to spread. It started at the bar, where the men nearest the door turned and froze. Then it rippled outward to the card tables, the far corners, and finally to the piano player, whose fingers faltered and stopped on the keys. The silence that followed was louder than the noise had been. Every eye in the room was fixed on them. Silas Vane was holding court at his usual table in the center of the room. He was drinking brandy from a crystal snifter. He looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. He did not look afraid. He looked like a man who had found a misplaced coin. "Well," Vane said. His voice carried easily in the quiet room. "The prodigal daughter returns, and she brought her pet dog." He stood up, smoothing his silk waistcoat. The men around him, his new enforcers, hired to replace the ones Elias had dealt with, shifted their hands to their belts. "I assume you have the $3,000 you stole from me." "Clara," Vane said, smiling. "Or have you come to work it off? I'm afraid the rates have gone up. You have caused me a great deal of inconvenience." Clara stepped out from behind Elias. She did not look at the floor. She did not look at the men leering at her from the bar. She looked straight at Silas Vane. "I have your payment." "Silas," she said. She reached into her coat and pulled out the ledger. She slammed it down on the nearest table. The sound was sharp, like a gavel strike. "I am here to balance the books," she said. Vane's smile flickered. He recognized the book. Of course he did. It was the record of his sins. "That is my property," Vane said, his voice dropping an octave. "You are a thief, Clara. No one cares what a thief has to say. The town cares," Clara said. She turned to the crowd. She saw faces she knew, men she had served drinks to, men whose hands she had slapped away, men who had looked through her as if she were furniture. "Joseph Miller," she said, her voice clear and ringing. A miner near the bar looked up, startled. "That was my brother," he muttered. "He died in the cave-in at Shaft 4 last November." Clara said, "The company said it was a structural failure. They said it was an act of God." She opened the ledger. She did not need to look at the page. She had memorized it. But here, on November 10th, 2 days before the collapse, there is an entry. A payment to the foreman to ignore the rotting timbers in Shaft 4. $50. The cost of a man's life. A murmur ran through the room. "Lies!" Vane shouted. "She's reading nonsense. Sarah Higgins." Clara continued, ignoring him. "Her husband died of the black lung. She sold her claim to Mr. Vane for $20 so she could buy a train ticket east." Clara pointed a shaking finger at Vane, but the claim was not empty. Was it Silas? The survey in this book says that claim sits right on the new silver vein. You bought it for $20 and sold the rights to the railroad for $5,000. You stole her future while she was weeping over her husband's grave. The murmur grew to a rumble. The miners were looking at Vane now. They were looking at the man who poured their drinks and held their debts. "Shut her up," Vane roared to his men. One of the enforcers, a scarred man with a shotgun, stepped forward. "Sit down, whore," he spat. "Before I—" The man did not finish the sentence. Elias moved. He did not draw his gun. He stepped forward and drove the heel of his boot into the man's knee. The bone snapped with a wet crunch as the man fell. Elias struck him across the temple with the heavy barrel of his Colt, sending him to the floor in a heap. Elias stood over him. The Colt leveled at the rest of the room. "Let her speak," Elias said. The violence was sudden and brutal, and it held the room in check. Vane looked around. He saw the mood shifting. He saw the anger in the eyes of the men he had exploited. He needed to break her hold on them. He needed to make her small again. "You are going to listen to her?" Vane laughed, walking toward the crowd with his arms spread. "You are going to listen to a saloon girl? A woman who spreads her legs for the highest bidder?" He pointed at Clara, his face twisting into a sneer. "Look at her. She is not a witness. She is a commodity. She has been used by half the men in this territory. Her word is worth less than the whiskey in your glass. She is trying to turn you against me, the man who gives you credit when the winter is hard, me, who keeps this town alive." He turned back to Clara, his voice dripping with venom. "You are nothing. Clara, you are a stain on this town. You think putting on a wool dress makes you decent? You will always be the girl from the gutter, and these men know it. They know what you are." The insult hung in the air, heavy and ugly. It was the weapon the town had always used against her, the assumption that her survival was a sin, and that her trauma made her a liar. Clara stood there. For a second, Elias thought she might break. He saw her shoulders tremble, but then she raised her head. "Yes," she said. Her voice was quiet, but in the silence, it carried to the back of the room. "I was a saloon girl. I poured your drinks. I laughed at your jokes. I let you touch me because if I didn't, I would starve." She looked at the miners, meeting their eyes one by one. "I know what I am," she said. But I also know what you are. I know who cries for his mother when he has had too much to drink. I know who writes letters to a wife he hasn't seen in 3 years. I know who is afraid of the dark. She took a step toward Vane. You call me a whore, Silas, because it makes you feel powerful. But I sold my time to survive. You sold your soul to buy a velvet vest. You killed good men. You robbed widows. You are the whore. Silas, you just charge a higher price. The room exploded. It wasn't a cheer. It was a roar of rage, a release of years of tension. A miner threw his glass at Vane. It shattered against the wall. Vane's face went purple. "Kill them!" he screamed. "Kill them all!" The 3 remaining enforcers went for their guns. "Get down!" Elias shouted, shoving Clara behind the heavy oak bar. The air filled with smoke and thunder. Bullets chewed into the wood of the bar, sending splinters flying like angry hornets. Elias returned fire, his Colt bucking in his hand. He dropped one man with a shot to the shoulder, spinning him around. The miners were scrambling, overturning tables for cover. Some were pulling their own weapons, old pistols, knives, even chairs. The room descended into chaos. Clara crouched behind the bar. She saw the shotgun the bartender kept on the shelf below the whiskey. She grabbed it. It was heavy, a double-barreled coach gun. She peeked over the top. Vane was retreating toward the back office, using the confusion to escape. But one of his men, a gunman in a black duster, had flanked the bar. He had Elias pinned down behind a table, his revolver hammering away at the wood. Elias was reloading, his fingers fumbling slightly with the cartridges. The gunman stepped out, raising his weapon for a clear shot at Elias's exposed flank. "Elias!" Clara screamed. She rose up. She didn't aim. At this range, she didn't need to. She pulled both triggers. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, bruising the bone. The blast caught the gunman in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him back into a stack of whiskey barrels. Elias snapped the cylinder of his Colt shut and looked at her. His eyes were wide. "Nice shooting," he yelled over the din. "I missed the head," she yelled back, racking the lever to eject the shells, though the gun was empty. The back door of the saloon burst open. Sheriff Grady charged in, followed by 2 deputies. He had a Winchester rifle in his hands. He saw Elias. He saw the bodies on the floor. "Drop it! Thorne!" Grady shouted. "You are under arrest for murder!" He raised the rifle, aiming squarely at Elias. Elias was trapped. His gun was empty, and he was out of cover. "This is it," Elias thought. He stood up, intending to draw fire away from Clara. Grady tightened his finger on the trigger. Suddenly, the barrel of a pistol was pressed against the sheriff's ear. "Drop the rifle." "Sheriff," a voice said. It was not Elias. It was Deputy Kincaid, the young man from Ironwood. No, it was the town's own deputy, a man named Miller, the brother of the miner Clara had named. He had been standing by the door, watching, listening. "Miller." "What are you doing?" Grady hissed. "Freezing. I am listening to the lady," Miller said. His voice was shaking, but his hand was steady. "Drop it, Grady, or I will spread your brains over the floorboards." The sheriff hesitated. He looked at the room. He saw the miners standing up, their faces hard. He saw that his authority had evaporated like water on a hot stove. He dropped the rifle. It clattered on the floor. At that moment, the front doors of the saloon swung open again. A tall man in a long, dust-covered coat stepped in. He wore a silver star on his chest that caught the light of the oil lamps. He carried a sawed-off shotgun in one crook of his arm and a piece of paper in the other. It was Marshal Sterling. He had ridden hard from the south, alerted by the telegram Marcus had sent from the Ironwood Junction 3 days ago. "Nobody move," Sterling boomed. His voice was like a rock slide. He looked at the wreckage of the room. He looked at Elias and Clara behind the bar. He looked at Sheriff Grady with a gun to his head. Then he looked at Silas Vane, who had frozen halfway to his office door. "Silas Vane," Sterling said, "I have a federal warrant for your arrest, conspiracy to commit murder, land fraud, racketeering, and the assassination of Judge Miller." Vane stared at him. He looked at his empire. now a shambles of broken glass and bullet holes. He looked at Clara, who was standing tall behind the bar, the empty shotgun still in her hands. "You have no proof," Vane snarled. "It is her word against mine." Sterling held up the paper. "This is a deposition from your lawyer, Mr. Pym. We caught him trying to board a train to San Francisco with a suitcase full of your money. He was very talkative." Vane's face went slack. Then, with the desperation of a trapped rat, Vane went for the derringer he kept in his sleeve. It was a foolish move. Elias, who had reloaded, fired once. The bullet struck Vane's hand, shattering the small gun and the bones beneath it. Vane screamed, clutching his ruined hand, and fell to his knees. "It is over. Silas," Clara said. Marshal Sterling signaled to his men, who had followed him in. They shackled Vane, dragging him up from the floor. They took the sheriff as well, stripping the badge from his chest. Sterling walked over to the bar. He looked at Elias, then at Clara. "You folks made a hell of a mess," Sterling said dryly. "We were just cleaning up." "Marshal," Elias said, holstering his gun. Sterling looked at Clara. He took the ledger from the table where she had left it. "This will put him away for life," Sterling said. "Or hang him. Likely the latter." He reached into his pocket and pulled out another document. It was the debt contract from the Gilded Spur. He held it up to the flame of a nearby lamp. The paper caught fire. It curled and blackened. The words, "Property of Silas Vane," turning to ash. "Miss Vance," Sterling said, dropping the burning paper onto the floor and crushing it with his boot. "You are free to go." The room was silent again, but the tension was gone. It was replaced by a strange, heavy exhaustion. Clara stared at the ash on the floor. Free. The word felt big and terrifying. She had fought for it, bled for it, but now that it was here, she didn't quite know what to do with it. She felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned. Elias was there. He looked tired. His coat was torn, his face smeared with soot, and he was favoring his left arm, but his eyes were clear. "It is done," he said. Clara nodded, tears finally spilling over. "It is done." They walked out of the Gilded Spur together. The night air outside was still freezing, but the wind had died down. The sky had cleared, revealing a vast canopy of stars that looked sharp and bright, like diamonds on black velvet. The town was quiet now. The confrontation was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. People stood on their porches, watching them pass. There were no cheers. There were no insults. There was just a respectful silence, the kind given to people who have walked through fire. But Clara could feel the weight of their eyes. She knew what they were thinking. She was the hero of the night. Yes, but tomorrow she would still be the woman who had lived in the saloon. The shame would not vanish overnight. The whispers would continue. She stopped in the middle of the street. She hugged the buffalo robe tighter around herself. "They are still looking," she whispered to Elias. "They are still judging." "Let them look," Elias said. He stopped and turned to face her. He took her hands in his. He didn't care who was watching. He didn't care about the sheriff, or the marshal, or the miners. "Clara," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the $500. The reward money he had carried since the beginning? No, he didn't have that. He had spent his last coin in Ironwood. He had nothing, except himself. "I have no money," Elias said. "I have no land. I have a horse that is half dead and a bad arm." He smiled, a crooked, genuine smile that made his face look 10 years younger. "But I am a free man, and I am asking you, right here in front of God in Granite Creek, to ride with me. Not as a fugitive, not as a witness, as my partner." Clara looked at him. She saw the man who had lowered his gun in the hallway, the man who had taken a bullet for her at the creek, the man who had walked into a jailhouse to set her free. She saw a future that was not defined by what she owed, but by what she chose. She looked at the townspeople watching from the shadows. Then she looked back at Elias. She stepped forward and kissed him. It was not a hidden kiss. It was public. It was defiant. It was a declaration that their love was not a sin to be hidden in the dark, but a truth to be lived in the light. "I will ride with you. Elias Thorne." she said loud enough for the wind to carry it. Anywhere. Elias lifted her onto the mare. He swung up behind her, wincing slightly but holding her close. They turned the horse south, toward the open valley where the snow was already beginning to melt in the morning sun that was yet to come. They left the gilded spur behind them, a dark monument to a past that could no longer touch them. They rode out of Granite Creek, two broken people who had fixed each other, heading toward a horizon that finally looked like hope. The thaw arrived in Granite Creek not with a sudden burst of warmth, but with a slow, grinding reluctance. The snow that had buried the town for months began to recede, turning the streets into rivers of black mud that sucked at wagon wheels and boots alike. The icicles that hung like daggers from the eaves of the buildings dripped a constant, rhythmic cadence, counting down the seconds until spring. For Elias Thorne, the change in season brought a restlessness that he could feel in his teeth. The trial, or the summary judgment that Marshal Sterling had delivered, was over. Silas Vane was in chains, en route to a federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, likely never to see the sun rise over the mountains again. The corrupt Sheriff Grady was gone, replaced by the nervous but well-meaning Deputy Miller. The gilded spur stood silent and boarded up, a dark tooth in the town's smile. But the silence that followed the violence was heavy. Elias walked down the boardwalk, his boots loud on the damp wood. He carried a sack of nails and a hammer, tools that felt strange in hands that had been shaped by reins and revolvers for 20 years. People nodded to him as he passed, but their eyes were skittish. They remembered the man who had shot up the saloon. They remembered the bounty hunter. They were grateful, yes, but they were also wary. A wolf that kills the bear is still a wolf. He reached the edge of town, where a small, derelict structure sat on a rise overlooking the valley. It had been a freight office once, abandoned when the company went bust. Now, the roof was sagging and the windows were gone, but the bones of the place were good oak. Clara was already there. She was wearing the indigo wool dress, the hem pinned up to keep it out of the mud. She was sweeping the rotting leaves from the porch, her movements vigorous and determined. When she saw him, she stopped and leaned on the broom, pushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "You are late," she said, though there was no heat in it. "I had to wait for the blacksmith to forge the hinges," Elias said. He set the sack down. He looked at her. In the weeks since the showdown, the hollow look of starvation had left her cheeks. There was color in her face, and her eyes, once constantly scanning for exits, now held a steady, contemplative light. But he also saw the tension in her jaw. Walking through town was hard today. He guessed. Clara shrugged, turning back to her sweeping. "It is always hard. Elias misses. Higgins crossed the street to avoid walking past me. The baker took my coin but would not look me in the eye. They are glad Vane is gone, but they do not know what to do with the woman who put him away. To them, I am still the ghost of their own complacency." Elias stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked under his weight. "We can leave," he said quietly. He had said it before. He said it every few days. Like a prayer he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "We can pack the horses," Elias continued. "We can be in Oregon by summer. There is land there, big timber, rain that washes everything clean. Nobody knows us there. Clara, you could be anyone you want." Clara stopped sweeping. She looked out over the muddy town, at the smoke rising from the chimneys, at the ugly scar of the mine on the hillside. "I am already who I want to be," she said. She turned to face him. Her grip on the broom handle was tight. "If we run, Elias, we tell them they were right. We tell them that a woman like me does not belong in a decent town. We tell them that shame is stronger than truth." She shook her head. "I spent 3 years hiding in that saloon, terrified of being seen. I am done hiding. This is my town too. I bled here. I saved lives here. I am not going to let Mrs. Higgins or anyone else chase me out just because I make them uncomfortable." Elias watched her. He admired her defiance, but it terrified him. He knew the world. He knew that memories were long and forgiveness was short. He wanted to take her somewhere safe, somewhere he could build a wall around her and keep the world out. But that was the old instinct. That was the protector trying to become the jailer. He remembered the promise he had made in the cave. I do not own you. He took a breath and let the idea of Oregon die a quiet death. All right, he said. We stay. Good, Clara said decisively. Now, fix the door. The wind is getting in. They worked through the morning. The physical labor was a balm for Elias. There was a simplicity to it that his life had lacked for a long time. You hit a nail. It holds the wood. You plane a board. It becomes smooth. It was honest. It was clean. But the past was not done with them yet. It was mid-afternoon when the rider appeared. He did not ride down the main street. He came up the back trail, skirting the edge of the mine. Elias, who was on the roof patching shingles, saw him first. He saw the way the man sat his horse, slouched, arrogant, a rifle scabbard prominent on the saddle. Elias slid down the ladder, his hand instinctively going to his hip, but the Colt was not there. He had left it wrapped in oilcloth inside the building, trying to live the new life. Clara, Elias said sharply. Go inside. Clara looked up from the garden plot she was turning over. She saw the rider. She did not run. She stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. Who is it? She asked. The rider reined in at the bottom of the slope. He was a young man, barely 20, with a face scarred by smallpox and eyes that burned with a frantic, drug-fueled light. Elias recognized him. It was a boy named Barrett, one of the hangers-on of Vane's gang, a kid who had run errands and dreamed of being a gunfighter. He looked desperate. His coat was threadbare, and his horse looked ridden half to death. Barrett, Elias said, his voice level. You are a long way from the border. Barrett's hand hovered near his pistol. He looked at Elias, then at Clara. He sneered. I heard Vane was gone, Barrett said, his voice cracking. I heard the whore and the hunter took him down. Watch your mouth, boy, Elias said. The threat was low, vibrating in his chest. Barrett laughed. A jagged sound. Or what? You do not have your iron, old man. I saw you on the roof. You are playing carpenter now. Domesticated. He pulled his pistol. It was a shaky, clumsy draw, but at 20 paces it was deadly enough. I want the money, Barrett said. There is no money, Clara said, her voice steady. The marshal seized Vane's assets. The government has it all. Don't lie to me, Barrett screamed, the gun waving wildly. Everyone knows Vane kept a stash. You were his favorite. You know where it is. Give it to me, or I will put a hole in your hero and drag it out of you. Elias calculated the distance. 20 feet, too far to rush him. If he moved, Barrett would shoot. If he didn't move, Barrett would shoot eventually anyway. The boy was high on something and terrified of starving. That made him more dangerous than a professional killer. Elias shifted his weight, preparing to take the bullet if it meant he could get his hands on the boy. But before he could move, a voice called out from the road behind Barrett. Drop it, son! Barrett spun in the saddle. Standing on the road was Deputy Miller, but he wasn't alone. Beside him was the blacksmith, holding a heavy iron hammer, and next to him was the baker, wiping flour from his hands, looking terrified but standing his ground, and Mrs. Halloway, the woman who ran the boarding house in town. We do not want any shooting here, Miller said. He had his hand on his gun, but he hadn't drawn it. This is none of your business, Barrett shouted, swinging the gun between Elias and the townspeople. It is our business, the blacksmith rumbled. Miss Vance is fixing up the old freight office. We are expecting her to order a new stove next week. She cannot do that if she is dead. It was a small thing, a commercial transaction, but it was an acknowledgement. They were claiming her as part of the community. Barrett looked at them. He saw 5 people. Then he saw a few more coming up the hill, miners who had heard the shouting. They weren't armed with guns, mostly, but they were a wall of humanity. Elias watched Barrett's face crumble. The boy realized he wasn't facing 2 outcasts anymore. He was facing a town. Go on, Barrett, Elias said softly. Ride out. Nobody needs to die today. Barrett looked at the gun in his hand. It felt heavy. The adrenaline drained out of him, leaving him just a cold, Hungry kid on a tired horse. He holstered the pistol. He spat on the ground, a final, weak gesture of defiance. "To hell with this town," he muttered. He turned his horse and kicked it into a gallop, disappearing over the ridge toward the Badlands. The tension broke. The blacksmith nodded to Elias, a silent communication of respect. Deputy Miller tipped his hat to Clara. "Everything all right here, ma'am?" Miller asked. "Yes, Deputy," Clara said. Her voice was thick with emotion she refused to let spill. "Thank you. Just doing rounds." Miller said, "Let us know if you need help with that stove." The crowd dispersed. They didn't cheer. They didn't make speeches. They just went back to their lives. But the line had been crossed. Elias turned to Clara. She was staring at the retreating figures. "They stood up for us," she whispered. "They stood up for you," Elias corrected. He walked over to her. "You were right," he said. "About staying." Clara looked at him, and then she smiled. It was a smile that reached her eyes, bright and unburdened. "Get back on the roof, cowboy," she said. "Those shingles will not patch themselves." 2 months later, the snow was gone completely. The valley was a riot of wildflowers, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush painting the slopes in vivid color. The river, once a frozen ribbon, was now wide and rushing. The sound of water a constant music in the air. The sign above the door of the renovated freight office was modest. It was hand-painted in neat, black letters. The Hearth, Lodging and Meals. It wasn't a saloon. There was no alcohol served. It was a boarding house, clean and simple. But it was more than that. The back 2 rooms were reserved, kept always ready for any woman or girl who needed a door with a lock that she controlled. Clara stood in the main room. It smelled of fresh bread and brewing coffee. She wiped down one of the tables. She wore a simple calico dress and a white apron. She looked tired. The work was endless. But she looked peaceful. The door opened and Elias walked in. He dusted the trail dust from his hat. He had been out for 3 days, hauling timber from the high ridge for the new church being built in town. It was hard work, heavy and repetitive, but it paid in gold coin and sleep that was dreamless and deep. He looked different. The tension that had defined him for years, the coiled spring readiness of the hunter, had softened. He still wore the Colt, but it was tucked away, a tool rather than an identity. "Smells good in here," he said. "Stew is on," Clara said, "and I saved you the heel of the loaf. I know you like it." Elias walked to the counter. He didn't sit down. He stood watching her. The transaction of their lives had changed. It was no longer about saving and being saved. It was about the small, daily exchanges of care. The bread saved, the wood chopped. The quiet presence in the dark when the nightmares came. And they still came, for both of them, though less often now. Elias reached across the counter and took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused from the axe handle. Hers was strong, warm, and alive. "I was thinking," Elias said. "Dangerous habit," Clara teased. "I was thinking that the timber contract is finished next week, and the freight line needs a partner to run the route to Silverton." "It is a 2-day ride," Clara said. "You would be gone nights." "I would," Elias said. "But the money is good. Enough to maybe buy that grazing land south of the creek, the plot with the good water." Clara went still. "You want a ranch? I want to build something that lasts." Elias said, "I want a place where we can raise horses, where we can look at the horizon and not worry about who is coming over it." He looked at her, his gray eyes open and vulnerable. "But only if you are with me. I am not doing it alone." Clara looked around the room she had built. She looked at the sanctuary she had created. It was hers. But her heart was big enough for more. "You can run the route," she said, "but you are home on Sundays. And you help me with the garden." "Deal," Elias said. He leaned over the counter and kissed her. It was a kiss that tasted of dust and coffee and promise. It wasn't the fiery, desperate collision of their escape. It was steady. It was the foundation of a house that would stand against the wind. That evening, they closed the hearth early. They walked down to the riverbank, hand in hand. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the valley. The air was cool but sweet, with the scent of pine and wet earth. The river rushed by, clear and cold, carrying the meltwater from the high peaks down to the plains. They stopped by a grove of cottonwoods. Elias sat on a fallen log and pulled Clara down beside him. She leaned her head on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her. It was the left arm, the one that had been shot. It still ached when the rain came, a permanent reminder of the cost of their freedom, but it was strong enough to hold her. Elias watched the water flow. He thought about the man he had been, the bounty hunter, the ghost. That man felt like a stranger now. He had laid down the burden of his past, not all at once, but piece by piece. With every nail he hammered and every mile he rode toward home. Clara watched the sky turn from blue to indigo. She thought about the ledger, burned to ash. She thought about the name whore and how it had lost its power, replaced by neighbor, friend, and love. She was not owned. She was chosen, and she chose him back every single day. "It is quiet," she said softly. "Yes," Elias said, "it is." They sat there as the stars came out, one by one, pinning the darkness in place. Two survivors in a vast, wild land, who had found that the greatest freedom wasn't just in surviving the winter, but in having the courage to believe in the spring. Thank you for listening to this story. Shoot me if you want freedom. Saloon Girl said, "The cowboy lowered the gun and chose love." I hope you enjoyed this journey through the dust, the snow, and the redeeming power of love in the American West. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from. I would love to know how far this story has traveled. If you enjoyed this tale, I encourage you to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier. And please, share your thoughts on Elias and Clara's journey in English in the comments below. Did they make the right choice to stay? I look forward to reading your insights.